look at this guy, Dave Nathan, joins us. He's Mr. Tar Heel. He's got North Carolina covered, and he and I have worked together over the years in the same role at one point, but not at the same time, which is good. That could have caused an issue. Dave, how are you?
Dave, I'm doing well. I'm actually going through a move right now, and I just discovered some of your old stuff in a desk drawer of mine from about 2001.
That is nice. A recording of my interview. I don't even know who that might be, with Steve Spurrier back in the day. All right, Dave, tell us about what you're doing nowadays, because I wanted you to have you on to talk North Carolina and Tennessee basketball, as you moved from Tennessee. About when and what do you do at North Carolina now, for those that don't know?
Dave, the last Tennessee football game I saw in a working capacity was in 2007, and I think at halftime Tennessee was up on Georgia 28-0, and eventually played in the SEC title game that year. Since I've left, it's it's been an interesting odyssey, but it looks like at least the Tennessee football team and the Tennessee basketball team are certainly trending in the right direction. But it's hard to believe I've been gone for better than 15 years, but a lot of good years on the beat in Knoxville, a lot of people I still keep in touch with, and I'm as happy as anybody to get to reconnect with some of the folks that'll be coming from Knoxville to Chapel Hill on Wednesday.
Yep, we certainly appreciate it. Give us a thumbnail sketch. I've got some specific guys I want to ask about, but this North Carolina team, if you go to Mars and spend like 5 years and come back, you know that North Carolina, Duke, those types of programs are always expected to be knocking on the door of a Final Four. But what do you think of this Carolina team in particular?
Well, the interesting word that you just used to describe a lot of the Blue Bloods is program, and it's so tough to actually have a program anymore with the transfer portal. And Carolina, after returning the bulk of the group that went to a national championship game a couple of years ago, has gone into the portal deep this year and has brought in 5 guys and 2 incoming freshmen. So there's 7 new players on this team that have the potential to contribute, from a team that missed the NCAA tournament last year after being ranked number 1 in the country at this point in time. So it was a pretty precipitous fall for the Tar Heels out of the rankings last year. And it all started about this time. And just interestingly enough, going back and looking at where Carolina was last year, going 1-2 and what was the PK Invitational and then a road trip to Indiana, kind of got me thinking about this year's Tennessee bunch that goes 1-2 in Maui, and then the very next game has to come all the way back east and play on the road at Carolina. From Rick Barnes' perspective, you'd like to think that Tennessee can handle this stretch a little better than North Carolina did last year, because it's tough when you play. I guess you open up against a number 4 team in the country, Michigan State. You play the back-to-back top 2 teams in the country and Maui awful well, and then you've got to play on the road at a top 20 Carolina team. So it's a tough stretch for Tennessee. It was certainly tough last year for North Carolina, but a different bunch this year. And just to get back to the core of this year's group, you've got returning seniors like RJ Davis and Armando Bacot. That's been the foundation of this program for the last 4 years. And then you've got transfers like Harrison Ingram and Cormac Ryan that I felt were like the emotional engines of this team, coming off a 3rd place finish in the Battle for Atlantis last week. So, some guys that you'll remember from probably Tennessee, Carolina games of the past, and then some new players that maybe you've seen elsewhere that are wearing a different color uniform.
Yep. Dave is the studio host for Carolina basketball on the Tar Heels Sports Network. Certainly appreciate him. Long time Tennessee media member as well. So Caleb, jump in there. You know your hoops well. Let's go ahead and quiz Dave Nathan for a moment.
Well, Dave, what I've realized is something that is very similar with Tennessee and North Carolina, but it's much more extreme with North Carolina this year in terms of improvement. They've both improved their 3-point shooting, but North Carolina has gone from Tennessee went from below average to above average. North Carolina, am I right, has seemed to have gone from transcendently bad at 3-point shooting last year to one of the best 3-point shooting teams in the country as far as I'm watching this year. Is that a fair assessment?
I guess time will tell if they're one of the best 3-point shooting teams in the country. But again, you go back to the transfer portal and Cormac Ryan, that started his career at Stanford, played the lion's share of his career at Notre Dame, and is now at Carolina. He hit 3 threes in the second half in one of the games in the Battle for Atlantis and helped Carolina immensely in that part of the game. R.J. Davis, again, scored a career-high 30 in the Arkansas game, and a lot of those came from distance. I think the biggest thing, though, just above and beyond shooting, is that Carolina's moving the ball a lot better this year than they were a year ago. If you watch the Tar Heels play last year, they had what I call ball stoppers, and that just makes it easy to defend. And it makes it tough to get open and get good shots. This year, Carolina's working it all over the place, and a byproduct of that, at least to this point of the season, has been a much better percentage from deep.
Dave Nathan, who is the studio host for the Tar Heel Sports Network, we certainly appreciate his time. Studio host for Carolina basketball as well. I would have argued strongly 10 years ago that this is a much more significant series for Tennessee to play North Carolina because of the pub, and I still would make that argument. Tennessee would rather have North Carolina on the schedule than vice versa. But how significant is this for North Carolina, who might every once in a while dip into Chattanooga, which has produced some good NBA talent? Shai Gilgeous-Alexander would be one, maybe over to Nashville. I mean, East Tennessee is not that far from Carolina and occasionally has an elite player. You think that helps Carolina in the future?
I don't know if the recruiting aspect of this game is overplayed or not. And again, the whole reason we're playing this game is because the ACC Big Ten Challenge had run its course, and the Big Ten properties of Fox weren't going to be permitted to play on the ESPN properties of what the ACC and the SEC get right now. So, in this day and age, basketball is just so fluid. The old days of going into a spot and coming out with a nice recruiting honeyhole, I think are sometimes overplayed. But to get back to why this game is important, you've got a North Carolina native in Rick Barnes, who just went into the North Carolina Sports Hall of Fame last summer, that gets to come back to, his home state to play a game. And he's got a lot of respect for North Carolina. And obviously there's some pretty deep plot lines to how the Carolina fan base feels about Rick Barnes going back to his days at Clemson. So there'll be some long memories. But it's just a good game, I think, in terms of college basketball at this point in the season, because for people that like college basketball, I mean, we are grasping to find what you could call maybe even a good home-and-home series with so many of these multi-team events that are in New York or Chicago, or where we just were in the Bahamas, or where Tennessee just was in the Maui Invitational. To get two teams of this caliber on somebody's home floor, it's got a different feel. The fans are going to be into it on Wednesday night. There's supposed to be a whiteout in Chapel Hill. The atmosphere, I think, will be first class the entire way. You don't get that without a big-time opponent like Tennessee coming into your building in the month of November.
So, Dave, you mentioned Rick Barnes. I want to talk about the coaches for a minute. Hubert Davis is a coach that is, I'm not going to say on the hot seat, but people were definitely disappointed about how last year went with North Carolina following the year before. Rick Barnes is seen as kind of a icon in coaching college basketball. However, over the last 20 years, even though Rick Barnes has coached all 20 and Hubert Davis has coached 2, Hubert Davis has more Final Four appearances than Rick Barnes to this point. So, if you're starting a program now, who would you hire? Hubert Davis or Rick Barnes?
Well, I think it all gets back to fit. I mean, what's your program? There was nobody that fit better at Carolina than Hubert Davis when he was hired 3 years ago from his uncle Walter Davis playing at UNC in the 70s, and Hubert Davis being a player in the 80s and 90s, and Coach Williams asking him to be an assistant about 10 years prior before he became the head coach. So, it comes down to fit, and I think fit's a big thing. I mean, you go down the road and you look at Duke. I mean, there are more experienced coaches than John Shire that have won a lot more, but John Shire was the right fit at the right time to be at that program. Same thing with Hubert Davis. And, Rick Barnes, a good fit at Tennessee. I mean, Hickory to Chapel Hill is about as far as it is from Hickory to Knoxville. And I've driven by those cities 1,000 times traversing Interstate 40 through the years. So at the end of the day, both coaches have gotten to Final Fours, and you can never get to enough Final Fours if you're anybody's fan base. You're just never going to please anybody. But I think it's pretty safe to say both fan bases have the right guy for their program, and I think at the end of the day, that's the important thing.
Portions of the program brought to you by Rick Terry Jewelry Design. They want to be your jeweler looking for affordable game day jewelry. How about the Fire Opals, the Tennessee tradition? Go to rickterryjewelry.com, rickterryjewelry.com. So what will you be looking for in the opening minutes of this game? Particularly, I was curious about North Carolina, their ability to play perimeter defense. If Tennessee tries to kick it down low and then back out, which is kind of Rick Barnes' style. What are some keys that you'll be looking for early in the game to see where this game might flow?
Yeah, I'd be curious to see how this game is officiated. And, we're still in November. And I think it's too early to start drawing hard and fast lines in the sand about the way that college basketball is going to be when we get into February, March. But from what we've seen the last few games, there has been an epidemic of fouling. And Carolina's been involved in some of those games, and in some of those games they haven't. Tar Heels were called for 30 fouls against Villanova, which was their most going back about 7 or 8 years. The team they played the next day, Arkansas, was called for 25 fouls in the game that preceded that matchup. And I'll leave it up to you guys to figure out how many fouls were called in the game between Carolina and Arkansas. There have been a bunch of whistles so far early. And you guys follow Tennessee enough to know that their bread and butter is playing a physical brand of defense that's the hallmark of any Rick Barnes coach team. If these teams are allowed to play and get up and down the floor, I think it comes down to who is best equipped to handle the physical nature of the ball game, because Carolina showed that it could play physically with Villanova that totally manhandled Memphis in the championship in Nassau last week. But if there are a bunch of whistles and depth becomes an issue and foul trouble becomes a concern, then all of a sudden things have to change, and we'll see if the players and coaches can adapt to the way this one's going to be called or not. But again, just a half dozen games through the season, I'm going to be really curious, not just for this game, but for the remainder of the season, just how physical this game is going to become, if it could become more physical, or if the players are going to have to let up a little bit and not play so much bully ball as at least we've seen for the first 3 weeks of 2023-24.
It's a great point. It's not been a pretty product. It really hasn't. Dave Nathan, the studio host for Carolina basketball on the Tar Heel Sports Network. Dave, we certainly appreciate your time. Best to you, my man, and always love getting to know you and work with you. I hope the family's doing fantastic, and maybe we'll talk before, I don't know, a Final Four matchup. North Carolina might be there, but I don't know that I feel good about Rick Barnes.
I'll tell you what, from a lot of the bowl projections right now, it seems like people have the Tar Heels and Vols slated for a spot in the Gator Bowl in a few weeks, right?
Yeah, that almost slipped me. So thanks for calling that out. Yeah, do you think Drake May would play in that game if it were Tennessee and North Carolina in the Gator Bowl?
That's a great question. Drake turned down a lot of money from a lot of other schools to come back to Carolina this year. And from the Carolina persuasion, you're thinking, boy, if Drake May leaves Carolina to go chase money at some other school, is there anybody safe in this climate? And, the answer was that he came back and he played this season. So, again, here we are at the end of the year, and there's going to be a bundle of money on the table for Drake May whenever he decides to turn pro. And I think most would assume that's going to be sooner rather than later. That'll be big. These bowl games, if you're not in the CFP, almost turned into what are you going to look like next year? And with the transfer portal and other guys that might opt out, it's the reality that Mac Brown and I'm guessing Josh Heupel and everybody else across the country has got to deal with right now. But it's it's a good question because Dave, I've seen some good ones at Tennessee and elsewhere throughout the SEC, and to have seen Drake play these last couple of years and to hear with people that know a lot more about pro football than I know about. I mean, he is as good as advertised and will be a high first-round pick, if not the top pick in the upcoming draft.
I'm going to show my age. He reminds me a little bit of a guy named John Elway. So there you go. I'm old. Dave, we certainly appreciate the time. And by the way, Drake May does have another year of eligibility, and he's got strong family ties to North Carolina. I hope he stays. I think it's a good story. Enjoy the game, Tennessee, North Carolina on Wednesday night. Dave, we'll talk to you.
Okay, and if I find any more old items from 2001, Hook, I'm going to ship them your way, okay?
That's awesome. By the way, let me see. Buzz Peterson just texted me. Did you know that he was in Michael Jordan's wedding? He likes to tell people.
I heard that they had a relationship dating back into the college days. Well,
you know,
they
I think it was one-sided.
Yeah, I think it was
one-sided.
really one-sided. Do you know they were best friends? And Michael Jordan never showed up to Thompson Bowling Arena. But anyway, Dave, have a blessed day and a great call. We appreciate it, buddy.
All right, fellas, take care.